Our new Pope would say good morning, and so do I. Above all, I would thank Peter Tusor and the other organizers of this colloque for the invitation to speak here. That gives me the occasion to come back to this splendid city of Budapest after many years, and obviously to the colleague and friend Alain Talon for his presentation. And I will begin with my paper, The Definition of a New Ecclesiastical Policy by the Papal Curia after the Council of Trent and its reception in Partibus. The Roman Church's greatest reform council, adjourned on 4th December 1563, after a solemn ceremony in which the voting prelates signed the decrees elaborated over many years. Just a few weeks later, in a sacred consistory, Pius IV verbally confirmed the Tridentine decisions, and the official papal bull was published in June 1564. On their own, these acts provided no guarantee that the Tridentine decrees would also produce the desired results within the Church and society. We therefore need to ask how, at what point, and by whom the body of church reforms was actually implemented in the territories and dioceses of the Orbis Catholicus. This was a highly complex, heterogeneous, and protracted process which essentially continued into the 20th century and was shaped by conditions in the Church in the various European countries and a diversity of actors with differing individual interests: the popes and their curial advisors, the princes, the bishops, the representatives of the old and the new orders, founded expressly for the purposes of ecclesiastical reform, the laity, and not at least the legates and nuncios. In this paper, I would like to concentrate on the first 6 decades of the reception of the Council. That is, I will focus on the period between 1563 and 1623, although the current state of research only allows me to address a few aspects and details. The concrete reform measures to be implemented in Partibus largely grew out of the decrees of the third and final period of the Council of Trent, which contained stipulations for the figure of the bishop, which was central to the entire reform project, above all, the selection of suitable candidates and the residential obligation. For reforming the secular and irregular clergy through provincial and diocesan synods or disciplinary measures in the course of visitations. And finally, for their theological training in newly established seminaries and colleges. If we wish to discover to what extent these provisions were put into practice, we primarily need to analyze 5 types of sources. First, the records of the post-Tridentine provincial and diocesan synods, for instance, the Free Salzburg provincial councils held between 1569 and 1576. Second, the reports of the apostolic visitations. Third, the status reports composed in the context of the ad limina visits after 1585. Fourth, the informative processes standardized in 1581 by the fundamental reform of Gregory XIV. And finally, fifth, the Acta Nunciaturae, consisting in letters and instructions. In what follows, I shall focus exclusively on the 5th genre of sources and pose particular questions to these texts. What can the instructions reports and reports of the nuncios tell us about the adoption of the decrees of the Council in the individual states? What role did the nuncios themselves play? Did they serve as moderators, or did they take an active part in these processes? Allow me to begin with a few basic remarks before turning to the texts themselves. First, the Roman Curia soon became persuaded that the decrees of the council could only be carried out in cooperation with the sovereigns. The cooperation between the Curia and the territorial princes could be quite tempestuous at times. However, since a princely sovereign rights and privilege of patronage proved highly obstructive in all territories to differing degrees to the implementation of the Tridentine reform program, for example, in filling and overseeing benefices, and these conflicts over jurisdiction often overshadowed the actual work of reform. Second, Rome was in principle capable of pushing forward the reforms in partibus independently in concert with the nuncios, bishops, and religious orders, but the support of the secular arm was of decisive significance. In order to create the framework of this, it was essential that the corresponding secular bodies officially recognized the Council of Trent. This recognition was therefore expressly sought, but because of the political situation in the territories, in some cases the council decisions were adopted very late, if at all. In Spain and Poland, official adoption already occurred in 1564, followed soon thereafter by Flanders and the Italian states. Since because of the 1555 Peace of Augsburg, no corresponding provision was possible for the empire as a whole, one had to choose to go through the territorial rulers, such as the Duke of Bavaria, for instance, often via the nuncios. But above all, the ecclesiastical princes, who were, however, slow to publish the decrees of the council. The Diocese of Prague adopted the council during the diocesan synod in 1605. In France, many of whose prelates had participated in the third session period of the council, which we know a good deal about because of the studies of Alain Telon, internal religious wars and tendencies towards a state church meant that despite the end of the civil wars and the conversion of Henri of Navarre, the council was adopted only quite late, with the vigorous support of Nuncio Antonio Ubaldini at the clerical assembly of 1615. Let us turn first to the research on the instructions that Klaus Jaitner and Silvano Giordano have been conducting with increasing intensity in recent years, publishing the relevant documents for three pontificates, Clement VIII, Paul V, and Gregory XV, covering the 3 decades between 1592 and 1623. Based on the fundamentally heterogeneous situation in partibus, briefly sketched here, it is not surprising that the Curia had no overall concept for implementing the Tridentine program of reform, as Jaitner notes in the introduction to the instruction of Clement VIII. And I'm quoting Jaitner. One, in fact, searches the instructions in vain for a comprehensive reform concept. Instead, they provide a series of individual measures based on the work of the Council. Essentially, the Tridentine reforms affected the secular and regular clergy with a strong accentuation, or rather strengthening, of episcopal rights and duties, not least to the detriment of the cathedral chapters. The intention was to sharpen the clerical pastoral image of the bishops, which could only be achieved by the strict selection of suitable candidates and scrupulous observance of the residential obligation. One important point of the Tridentine reform program was the call for the establishment of seminaries for the theological training of the clergy, especially in regions far from Rome, which were subject to strong Protestant influence, such as in the Holy Roman Empire, for example, the ecclesiastical territories, Bavaria, the Austrian hereditary lands, and Poland. The reform of the religious orders proved a difficult terrain, which also appears in nearly all of the instructions. The nuncios were expressly exhorted to cooperate with the representatives of the orders and partibus, the provincials, to combat abuses affecting the administration of the monasteries and convents and the daily life of the communities. Here too great emphasis was placed on exercising the greatest possible caution in choosing the heads of monasteries and convents. A close cooperation arose between the nuncios and the orders that were also dedicated to the Tridentine reforms, above all the Jesuits, but also the Capuchins, Carmelites, and Somascans, etc. In the case of the women's orders, the main concern was to maintain enclosure, which the Council of Trent had sought to tighten, but implementation appeared problematic even to some nuncios, since a ban on charitable activities would have robbed these institutions of their subsistence. Thus, the nuncio in Savoy, Vincenzo Lauro, asked what was to become of the Franciscan and Augustinian sisters if they were forced to follow strict enclosure. Up until that point, they had lived from alms which they received for their activities outside the convent walls. Nearly all instructions draw the attention of the nuncios to the prohibition of books of heretical content. Bishops and nuncios were to supervise booksellers to ensure they were observing the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. In the Holy Roman Empire, there was close cooperation between the nuncios and the Imperial and Apostolic Book Commissioner in Frankfurt. Monitoring of the printing press and the book trade, however, was a special topic for the papal representations of the Apennine Peninsula, but also for the neighboring institutions, the nunciatures in Switzerland and Graz, since the papal Curia was anxious to protect Italy, in particular, from the influence of literature regarded as heretical, with the ports Venice, but also Pisa and Livorno, naturally being viewed as special neuralgic points. Having seen the expectations that the Roman Curia expressed in the instructions to the nuncios and legates regarding implementing the Tridentine reforms in the various territories to which they were being sent, we now turn to the everyday life and practice of the nuncios. In order to do so, however, I must go back to the pontificate of Gregory XIII and the concrete case of the nunciature at the imperial court between 1578 and 81, which I have studied in detail in recent years. If we begin by analyzing the instructions for Orazio Malaspina and Ottavio Santa Croce, which were drawn up in 1578 and 1581, respectively, it becomes clear that in each instance, only 3 of a total of 10 and 20 points, respectively, refer to church reform. These few passages mainly revolved around the question of the bishoprics and their superiors, with the problem of the regalia and the vacancies of Hungarian bishoprics being specific topics of the nunciature at the imperial court. I shall return to this matter later. Only the instruction for Santa Croce emphasized the nuncio's superintendence of the seminaries in Prague and Vienna. The scant mention of reform topics in the instructions cited here, however, is compensated for by the fact that the faculty bulls issued for the nuncios around the same time noted concerns over implementing the decrees of the Council of Trent and powers of visitations. But what did things look like in practice? In fact, we should not underestimate the importance of the central figure of the Tridentine reforms, the bishop, as a subject of the nunciature reports. As we have seen, the regalia awarded by the emperor to ecclesiastical princes of the empire without previous papal recognition of the office holders were a thorny issue. Conflicts between the emperor and the pope arose in this connection with the bishops of Bamberg, Bremen, Osnabrück, Paderborn, and Halberstadt, and the nuncios had to intervene on numerous occasions. In the course of the appointments or elections of bishops or coadjutors, the nuncios exerted direct or indirect influence on the emperor and the cathedral chapters, especially in the cases of Olomouc 1578-79, Münster 1579, Salzburg and Prague, all 1580, as well as Cologne 1577 and 1584. Important representatives of the imperial episcopate, chief among them Ernest of Bavaria, did not correspond to the Tridentine ideal of a bishop. During the period in question here, the Duke of Bavaria succeeded Cardinal Grossbeck as Bishop of Liège. The Wittelsbach had thus gained a third bishopric in addition to Freising and Hildesheim. At the same time, the acquisition of the economically and strategically significant Prince-Bishopric of Liège enormously increased his power and prestige and that of his house. The Pope confirmed Ernest, but informed his nuncio at the imperial court that Ernest would no longer be in the running to succeed to the See of Münster, which he had apparently hoped for, because of his violation of the residential obligation and the ban on the accumulation of benefices, which was already flagrant at this point. Nevertheless, it was political considerations that dominated when Rome subsequently recognized the elections of Ernest of Bavaria as Bishop of Münster and Archbishop Elector of Cologne. A particular issue in connection with the filling sees of episcopal sees were the vacancies of Hungarian bishoprics, which belong to the area of responsibility of the nuncio at the imperial court. It was not so much the imperial right of appointment per se that was problematic, but rather the emperor's practice of leaving several Hungarian bishoprics vacant for longer periods in order to save money to spend on stronger border defense. The permanent Ottoman threat to the emperor's frontiers meant that the imperial coffers depended on regular injections of money, which the approval of taxes by the estates could not guarantee. For Rome, too, defense against the Turks had high priority, but in the view of the Curia must not lead to a neglect of ecclesiastical interests. After all, longer vacancies were worrying not only from a pastoral viewpoint, they also weakened the Catholic position at the Hungarian Diet, where the bishops had seats and votes with sufficient representation and only with sufficient representation could they, together with the Catholic nobility, achieve a majority against the Protestants. In April 1578, after intense efforts by the Nuncio Delfino, the emperor finally nominated a bishop for Dior and Vats, in conjunction with a major shake-up at the top of the Hungarian dioceses. The archbishopric of Esztergom, to be sure, remained without a metropolitan. This vacancy, which was felt especially keenly at the Roman Curia, lasted more than 20 years after the death of Cardinal Verantius de Schibenik. Only in 1595, Rudolf nominated a new metropolitan. The nunciature reports of those years, such as those by Orazio Malaspina, Ottavio Santa Croce, or Giovanni Francesco Bonomi, make it clear that they regularly urged the emperor to appoint a new archbishop of Esztergom quickly. An observation by Nuncio Malaspina, according to which the call to nominate a new archbishop for Esztergom was supported by the Catholic and Protestant Hungarian estates, seems especially instructive in this context. The function of the Metropolitan of Esztergom was clearly regarded as a national symbol by the Hungarian nobility, regardless of confessional difference. After their election or nomination, holders of church benefices, but also candidates for the seminaries, were obliged to take the Tridentine Professio Fidei. The nuncios of this period recorded the professions of the prior of Klosterneuburg, the bishops of Olomouc and Prague, among others, and sent them to Rome. The situation in the empire's bishoprics gave much occasion for concern beyond the figure of the bishop. Serious unrest in the cathedral chapters were reported from Salzburg and Münster. The nuncios at the imperial court could gain a personal impression of the situation in the bishoprics, above all in Prague, the seat of their nunciature, but also during their travels. In his report on a visit to Bamberg, Malaspina suggested measures to increase ecclesiastical discipline and implement the Tridentine reform program. While traveling to the imperial court in Prague, Santa Croce gained negative impressions of conditions in Ratisbon, but also in Passau, which were consistent with the results of the visitation by the extraordinary Nuncio Feliciano Linguarda in that area. To be sure, we cannot speak of comprehensive observations and measures by the nuncios. As we have seen, the training of theologically and personally suitable priests was a central point in the Tridentine reform program. Important educational institutions run by the Jesuits, which were under the supervision of the nuncios at the imperial court, existed in Vienna and Prague. The nuncios were responsible above all for guaranteeing the smooth financing of these institutions, calculating operating costs, modes of paying out the sums of money transferred from Rome. At the time of the nunciature of Orazio Malaspina, the seminary in Prague had 18 students. Some of them occasionally preached at the castles near Prague. The same is reported of the alumni of Vienna, when Nuncio Malaspina visited the seminary during his journey from Italy to Prague in autumn of 1578. And he wrote that 29 students were studying there. There are also occasional mentions of the Collegium Germanicum in Rome, where Jesuits trained priests for the Holy Roman Empire. Its students were, at the wish of the Curia, to receive consideration when vacant benefices were allocated. Meanwhile, the Nuncio Delfino recommended the founding of similar seminaries in Ingolstadt and Graz. In 1577, the Curia signaled its consent for the capital of Styria, and the first payments for Graz financing was still in the hands of the Apostolic See, began in early 1578. Until the establishment of the Graz Nunciature in 1580, the nuncio at the imperial court bore responsibility for this institution too. In order to alleviate the serious shortage of priests in the lands of the crown of St. Stephan, as early as 1554, Ignatius Loyola had suggested the establishment of an institution in Rome for the training of Hungarian clerics, similar to the German college. The plan, which had already been considered by Pius V, was only realized in 1579, however, under Gregory XIII. The Pope envisioned financing and maintaining the college by drawing upon the assets and revenues of the Hungarian Order of St. Paul, which had been located in Rome since the early 15th century. According to the Curia, their monastery in the Celio had recently been the scene of grave abuses, lack of discipline, poor administration, ignoble liturgical services. In the very same bull, Gregory XIII therefore ordered the dissolution of the monastery and the establishment of the Hungarian college. The project of an autonomous Hungarian seminary soon proved a failure, however. Through Nuncio Malaspina, the Hungarian bishops were asked to nominate suitable Hungarian candidates, including a few Transylvanians. But they failed to recommend even the intended 12 students. Nuncio Malaspina's suggestion to consider Croatian candidates as well was not taken up in Rome. At that point, the decision had already been taken to merge the newly established Hungarian college with the Collegium Germanicum, which had previously been responsible for the Hungarian lands. The recruitment problem was likely to the main reason for this measure, but there were also difficulties with the financial endowment of an independent Hungarian institution. With regard to enrollments, even after the fusion, the contingent of 12 places was not filled for lack of suitable candidates. In the period between 1580 and 1600, a total of 45 Hungarians studied at the college, 20 of them from the Archdiocese of Esztergom, 6 from Transylvania, 5 from the Diocese of Győr, 4 from Eger, 3 each from Zagreb and Varaždin, and 1 from the Archdiocese of Kalocsa. 1/3 of them, however, failed to complete their studies in Rome. During the period that interests us here, the nuncius also addressed a number of matters concerning the religious orders. The Scots monasteries of Ratisbon and Erfurt, whose leadership was reorganized by the Curia in 1577, were commended to Delfino. The emperor's travels to the hereditary lands also offered the nuncio who accompanied him the opportunity to inspect some monasteries personally. Thus, Delfino visited Marienstern Abbey, a Cistercian convent in Lusatia, and granted the nuns confirmation. Overall, the convents of Lusatia, a region that had become heavily Protestant, only survived thanks to the efforts of the nuncios. In the area of monastic reform, the nuncios were instructed to support the work of the provincials. In some cases, the Pope's representatives made direct disciplinary interventions on the ground, as in the case of a Franciscan monastery in Prague. On the way to Prague, the Nuncio Santa Croce gained a positive impression of the most recent reform efforts during a visit to the Augustinian canonry of Klosterneuburg. The establishment of seminaries for young clerics was discussed as a means of overcoming the crisis of the religious orders too, but the premonstratensians proved reserved. The Pope donated money personally for the restoration of the Augustinian convent in Prague and the founding of the seminary. The Jesuits were recommended to the particular care of the nuncios. The significance of the Society of Jesus for the training of priests already generated a number of contacts between the nuncios and the rectors of the colleges. Beyond this, though, the nuncios maintained close personal relationships with the Jesuits, which were expressed not least in the fact that Bartolomeo Porcia was buried in 1578 in the Jesuit church in Prague, and Minuccio Minucci, who had served several times as an extraordinary apostolic nuncio to the Holy Roman Empire, was interred in the Jesuit church in Munich in 1604, while a Jesuit gave the funeral sermon for Ottavio Santa Croce in Prague's St. Vitus Cathedral in 1581. During those years, the records of the nunciature at the imperial court make no mention of abuses, above all in connection with enclosure in the nunneries. Matters relating to the Inquisition play virtually no role in the nunciature reports I examined. Although, because of the precarious state of the records of the Holy Office for this period, it is impossible to make any precise statements about direct contacts between that agency and the nuncios at the imperial court. The official correspondence between the Nunciature at the Imperial Court and the Secretariat of State between 1577 and 81, at any rate, notes only one instance of the Congregation of the Inquisition being contacted via the Secretary of State, Cardinal Gallio. This was in the matter of Giovanni Maria Pedarelli, an Augustinian hermit who had escaped from the Inquisition prison in Venice and asked Bartolomeo Porcia to intercede on his behalf in Rome. When it came to the dissemination of writings declared to be heretical, the nuncios at the Imperial Court were asked to intervene on concrete occasions. We know the authors and titles of two texts that Nuncio Delfino wished Rudolf II to take out of commission: Kratos, Necrologus of Maximilian II, and De Beatitudine by Andreas Lang. The emperor himself promised to conduct a purge of all the bookshops in his lands. Apparently, the imperial ambassador in Constantinople had helped to smuggle forbidden books from France to Germany, and Germany to the Ottoman capital. At Malaspina's request, Rudolf II instructed his envoy there, Joachim von Zinzendorf, to end these abuses and demand the return of the books. In 1578, the Basel printer Ambrosius Froben was preparing a new edition of the Talmud. When Cardinal Gallio learned of this, he first instructed the nuncios Delfino and Porcia to prevent the printing or the dissemination of the printed work. Rudolf II addressed the city of Basel several times regarding this matter. In March 1579, Gallio promised Malaspina some information on the question of the Talmud to aid in his negotiations on the matter at the Imperial Court. Apparently, the nuncio lacked the requisite theological background to treat this question. In order to prevent an imperial publication ban, the Basel printing shop, for its part, had consulted the Hebrew scholar Fra Marco Marini in Venice on the arrangement of the text, without previous authorization from the Apostolic See. For this reason, Marco Marini was summoned to Rome, where instead of the expected punishment, he acquired a splendid reputation. At the same time, Secretary of State Gallio rejected Malaspina's suggestion to dispatch an imperially appointed expert to Basel. The nuncios Ninguarda and Bonomi, who were active in the southwest of the empire and in Switzerland, respectively, now also became involved in the matter of the Talmud. Thus, the reform themes of the instructions are roughly consistent with those we encounter in the Nunciature reports. A reading of the Nunciature reports, however, makes clearer the possibilities the nuncios had to implement the reforms. How nuncios on the ground applied the decrees of the Council of Trent was decisively depended not least on the theological profile of these papal envoys. The instructions normally characterize the envoy, usually at the beginning of the text, but occasionally also at the end. Conversely, this text genre also allows us to piece together the picture of an ideal papal nuncio around 1600. Alongside the traits of political and diplomatic ability, a good general education, expertise, prudence, experience, tact, he was defined above all by his blameless way of life, integrita, probitas, virtu, buona vita, as well as his piety and religious zeal. The council had a momentous consequence, however, not merely for its substantive definition of the nunciature, but also for the person of the nuncio himself. While before the mid-15th century laymen were still occasionally entrusted with representing the papacy abroad, after that time it was exclusively clerics who served in that capacity. There was an increasing tendency to dispatch bishops as envoys. The reasons why the Curia and the Pope choose bishops were less questions of protocol or ceremony, but jurisdictional and pastoral considerations, since bishops had more extensive faculties than simple priests, and because of their specific sacramental authority, could conduct ordinations and confirmations. This was important particularly in regions where the local bishops had in some cases not received episcopal consecration and sometimes not even ordination as priests. We should therefore not underestimate the associated increase in authority, which was supposed to lend more weight to the nuncio's various supervisory and disciplinary measures, for example in conjunction with visitations. The last nuncio to be sent to the imperial court without episcopal rank was the referendarius Alfonso Visconti in 1589, and the last sent to Graz was in 1592. The latter was apostolic protonotary Girolamo Portia, who was appointed a bishop in 1598. All his successors would already be bishops when they began their nunciatures. In Cologne, in contrast, where a nunciature was established in 1584, only bishops served as papal nuncios for obvious reasons. A further tendency is evident in this connection, that is the appointment of nuncios as titular bishops or bishops in partibus infidelium, which meant that these prelates, while enjoying episcopal powers, did not have an ordinary diocese with pastoral duties. This measure was a consequence, not least, of the residential obligation for local bishops that had been demanded since Trent based on a negative past experience. For example, bishops' lack of discipline, the accumulation of benefices, and so on. To be sure, this principle was not always adhered to, since the regular remuneration and also the extraordinary income of a nuncio often did not suffice to ensure a way of life consistent with their status. When appointing nuncios, the Curia repeatedly had recourse to local bishops, which created the grotesque situation of persons who had themselves been dispensed from the residential obligation, being sent to enforce it in partibus. At any rate, as in the case of the Cologne nuncios, Albergati, Montoro, Carafa, Alfieri, Chigi, there was some effort to see to it that there were small dioceses. From the mid-16th century, increasing efforts were made to ensure that prelates entrusted with the nunciature had a profound theological education and had been actively involved in reform debates, sometimes even as participants in the Council of Trent. It is surely no accident that several nuncios at the imperial court during the second half of the 16th century, Melchiorre Biglia, Giovanni Delfino, Bartolomeo Porcia, Orazio Germanico Malaspina, Giovanni Francesco Bonomi, Filippo Sega, Cesare Speciano, belonged to the circle of reformers around the Milanese Archbishop Charles Borromeo, and these appointments not only underline the reform bishop Borromeo's importance for the nunciatures, but also document the cardinal's good informal and official contacts with the Roman Curia. We should also keep in mind, however, that what ultimately counted for a career as a nuncio was not the candidate's theological, but rather his juridical studies. Thus, we found a large number of nuncios who, before their missions, held the position of referendarius of the two signatures, a key curial office requiring a doctorate of Roman and canon law, which suggests that when selecting their representatives in partibus, the popes were chiefly concerned with the competent handling of jurisdictional conflicts. Some concluding remarks. In the 6 decades after the Council of Trent ended, the Roman Curia took great pains to implement the reform ideas and decisions developed there. The precondition, however, was support for this process from the secular arm, which in turn required the survival of the corresponding states as Catholic territories. A lasting reform of the Church could only begin when each of the states had become internally and externally consolidated in the Roman Catholic sense. This applied above all, but not only, to the Holy Roman Empire. In France, it was the conversion of Henry of Navarre that set the direction. In Cologne, the deposing of Truchsess von Waldburg and the election of Ernest of Bavaria. In Styria, the defense against internal and external enemies. In Bohemia, the victory at the White Mountain. If this political constitutional framework stood, the Curia could proceed with the help of the nuncios to effectively push forward and implement the reform process. It is therefore no surprise that among the nuncios of the post-Tridentine era, the diplomatic political agenda continued to weigh more heavily than the ecclesiastical religious one. This is also true, by the way, of the so-called reform nunciatures established in Styria, Cologne, Switzerland, and Flanders, beginning in the 1570s. Thus, it is worth noting that we only occasionally find references to Catholic reform in the reports of the Graz nuncios, especially Girolamo Portia, as we know from recent publications by Rainer and ZINGERLE, and that they are underrepresented in comparison to political topics, dynastic questions, defense against the Turks, the Uskok problem. For that reason, I believe we need to rethink the term Reform Nunciatur, since the distinction between political and Reform Nunciatures is untenable, in my view, given that the task profile of all papal representatives in partibus, corresponding to the dual role of the Pope, contained spiritual, religious, and secular elements, and that the two areas were inextricably linked. To be sure, we also need to establish that even in states with consolidated Catholicity, Spain, with important territories of Milan and Naples, but also Portugal, Venice, Tuscany, Savoy, and so on, the jurisdictional conflicts between the Apostolic See and the state authorities represented a significant hindrance to the reform process, which was probably most pronounced in early 17th century Venice. As Wolfgang Reinhardt has quite properly remarked in this context, and I will quote him, "It is unmistakable we find ourselves in the era of the early modern state and no longer in that of the universal church." The nuncios took on an important coordinating role in the adoption and implementation of the reform decisions of the Council of Trent, not at least because of the permanent character of the missions, la nunciatura permanente stabile, in that period, and this is an important aspect. The surviving official text from the nunciatures, reports, instructions, faculties, therefore represent a first-rate source that permits us to characterize this mediating function of the nuncios more precisely. Ideally, these official texts will be supplemented by additional official and private sources, such as journals of the nuncios, the correspondence of nuncios with members of the episcopate and the religious orders, but also the laity and visitation reports. To understand better the personal context and network of the nuncio, bishops, abbots, ministers, fellow diplomats, which constituted the framework for the application of the Tridentine reform by the papal envoys in the conflictual period around 1600. Thank you.